long time no see. I feel like we don't really need to talk too much about the fact that I haven't made a video for like over a month. Just like life, you know, it's a thing. But today I thought I would catch you up on what I've been reading in the past couple months. I'm going to be finally wrapping up everything that I read for the Irish Readathon, as well as the books that I read in April. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with the books that I read for the Irish Readathon, including our group read, Boys Don't Cry by Fina, Scarlet. It was so fun reading this with so many people. We had our Discord server where we were discussing the book. I must admit I wasn't as active as I would have liked to be, but I had a fantastic reading experience with this book. I sat down in bed one evening anticipating maybe reading 50 pages or so before bed, and I ended up reading the whole thing. I thought this book was absolutely fantastic. This book has a lot to do with masculinity, and it follows the story of two brothers, their relationship with each other, the relationship that they have with their parents, but particularly the strained relationship that they have with their father, and how masculinity plays a role in those relationships as well. It's also a book that is about illness in children, and that is not something that I knew going into this book, but it was something that I found very hard-hitting, and I think that really difficult topic was handled really sensitively. I also really loved how the author used dialect in this book. It definitely has that kind of Dublin dialect accent to it as well, which is something I really appreciate in writing. It's also a book that is about gangland crime in Ireland, and I definitely love Irish books that kind of have that authenticity to it, you know, depict those kind of experiences, because I think so often throughout pop culture Ireland is presented as this kind of rolling green hills kind of idyllic utopia, and that's not what it is. There is a huge amount of gangland crime in Ireland, and it was depicted really authentically in this book. I would highly recommend it. I also read The Gifts That Bind Us by Caroline O'Donoghue. This is one of my most anticipated releases for 2022. I love Caroline O'Donoghue's writing, and I loved the first book in this series, All Our Hidden Gifts. I absolutely raved about it last year, and basically ever since. It's quite difficult to talk about this book without spoiling the first book, but in the first book we meet Maeve, who comes across an old tarot deck and realizes that she has quite a talent for tarot reading. So she starts doing a lot of readings at her school, including a reading for her former best friend, where something seems to go wrong. Her former best friend then goes missing, and Maeve feels like she is somehow responsible for this. And as we delve further into their story, we discover more about exactly how powerful Maeve is. And without spoiling the ending of the first book, in this sequel we are discovering even more about her powers, but also the powers of those around her as well. We follow her friendships evolving, her romantic relationship evolving. I absolutely loved the romantic relationship in the first book, and it was really interesting to see how it developed in a really authentic way in this sequel. I also really appreciated how this sequel continued to engage with social and political topics that are ongoing in Ireland and across the globe. And I also found it really interesting seeing how different characters have different attitudes towards their hometown. You know, some characters are very protective of their hometown and very much want to stay there. Some people are harboring a level of resentment to the lack of opportunities in their town and really want to move away. There is so many things that are going on in both of these books, this book and the first book in the series. And while I didn't love the sequel quite as much as I enjoyed the first book, I still really liked this book and thought it was fantastic. And if you are into Irish, gay, witchy kind of reads, I definitely recommend this one. Let's stick with some Irish gay YA while we're at it. So I read Not My Problem by Keira Smith. So this is about the relationship between Aideen and Maeve. Maeve is super ambitious. She has so many things going on in her school and social calendar. She is someone who is under a lot of pressure. Her father is the school head teacher, and Aideen is much more of a rule breaker, and they come together in unlikely circumstances when they realize that they may be able to help each other out. And the way that they're going to help each other out is Aideen is going to push Maeve down the stairs. This incident kind of snowballed into them doing a lot of favours for people in their school, and it's a lot of fun seeing this kind of chaos unfold, but also the bond between these two girls growing. I really liked seeing the difference in both of their home lives as well, and it really reminded me that you only know a certain portion of someone's life. I look back on, my days in high school, and there was so much that I didn't know about what people had going on at home, and I think this book really highlights that. I'm definitely keen to read more from Keira Smith. I think she's a really great writer, and as I said, would like to read more from her. I also read Big Girl Small Town by Michelle Gallen. I really wanted to like this book more than I did. I did think it was really great. I think it was just one of those books that I had kind of 5-star expectations for, and it was really good. It was just missing that level of spice that I want for a 5-star read. We are following Magella, who lives quite a monotonous life. She goes to the chippy to work every day. She wears the same sort of clothes. She comes back and watches the same TV show. But Magella has quite a complicated home life. Her father disappeared during the Troubles, and this is set in Northern Ireland. Her mother is also an alcoholic, so she doesn't really have a great support network around her, and that is shattered even further when her grandmother dies. But Magella begins to realise that maybe this tragedy is an opportunity for her to realise that there is more to life than the life she is living right now. This is written in a very strong Northern Irish dialect, to the point where I struggled with it slightly at some points, so be aware of that going into it if it's not a dialect that you're hugely familiar with. But as I said, books written in dialect is something that I really enjoy, so I really appreciated that element of the writing. I also really enjoyed how we are very much in Magella's head. We are seeing things from her perspective and seeing how she misunderstands some situations, and often how that misunderstanding is taken advantage of, and that was really heartbreaking to see. I think this was a really accomplished story, and I would be keen to read more from this author. I think maybe I just went into it with too high expectations. I also read This Happy by Neve Campbell. This is a book that I read in one sitting when I was flying to Barcelona. Actually, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I read The Gifts That Bind Us when I was in Barcelona. So I feel like I'm forever going to associate this book with that trip, as I will with this book. So this book is about Alana, who, when she was 23 years old, she had an affair with a much older married man. 6 years later, Alana is newly married to a different man. When she was with this married man 6 years previously, she went to stay with him in rural Ireland, and things did not go well. Now, 6 years later, when she is with her husband, she sees the landlady that she stayed with 6 years ago, and everything from that time in her life starts to come back. So we're hearing about both times in her life simultaneously, and that's a device that I really enjoy in fiction quite often. I also often enjoy books that have relationships with a kind of difference in power dynamic, and also what I like to call young women figuring their shit out fiction. But unfortunately, this book didn't leave a huge impact on me. I definitely enjoyed the reading experience, but it kind of just washed over me. It wasn't something that I found particularly memorable. I don't think it stood out against other books that I've read about kind of similar-ish topics. Nonetheless, I thought it was a really solid novel, just not necessarily a new favourite. Lastly, for the books from the Irish Readathon, I have 3 books of non-fiction to talk about. I'm going to start with the one for kids, and that is Break the Mold by Sinead Burke, and this has illustrations by Natalie Byrne. I spoke about this book in my video on children's non-fiction, so I will leave that linked down below in the description and in the cards if you want to find out more about it. But I thought this little book was really, really good. I would highly recommend it if you have a young person in your life, or even if you yourself are feeling like you need a little bit of motivation. I would definitely put this in the same kind of area as Marcus Rashford's book, You Are a Champion. It's a book about encouraging children to celebrate who they are, embracing their differences, and using your voice to make the world a fairer, more inclusive place. Sinead Burke is a teacher, she's an activist, and she's a little person. She is responsible for creating a word for little person in the Irish language, and I believe she was also the first little person to be on the cover of Vogue and also attend the Met Gala. So very accomplished young woman, and definitely someone that we can all take inspiration from. I read Republic of Shame by Kailyn Hogan. This was a book that I was reading throughout the entirety of the month of March. It took me the whole month to read it because I was reading it at a really slow pace. It is also got quite small font in it as well. This is a book about the influence of the Catholic Church in Ireland, how the Catholic Church is interwoven with the Irish state, and the impact that the Catholic Church ended up having on our laws, and the detrimentally negative impact that had on so many people, in particular women, and how so many women were mistreated at the hands of the collusion of the Catholic Church and the Irish state. This book is incredibly well researched. The author delves into so many statistics and reports, but also talks to people directly affected by these circumstances. There are so many horrors that are discussed in this book: children being taken from their mothers, abuse, neglect, unexplained mass graves. It's a furiously necessary book, but one that is remarkably hard-hitting. And I also read The Problem with My Normal Penis by Obioma Egola. The author is of mixed Nigerian and Irish heritage, and he discusses his heritage quite a bit throughout the book, and I found his discussion of that dual heritage and what it is like to be a black man with Irish heritage really fascinating, and I think it is a kind of experience that we should be discussing more and hearing more about because it's so important, as are all of the topics discussed in this book. It is a book about black masculinity and the stereotyping that comes with that, the title coming from that stereotyping that all black men have huge penises, and how that stereotype is actually based on really damaging things, like it's based on seeing black people as threatening or barbaric. So that kind of racism that black men face almost seems like it's a compliment, but it's actually disguising something that is really damaging. So many important topics discussed in this book. I have read quite a few books on race over the past few years, and this is one that gave me so much to think about and really furthered my thinking on a lot of topics. Now on to the books that I read in April, and while we're doing non-fiction, let's stick with it. I read The Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. I loved this book. Easily 5 stars. Absolutely fantastic. The title is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's pretty self-explanatory. It is a curious history of sex. We are going back to antiquity and following all the way up through the ages into the modern day, looking at various topics to do with sex. The weird, the wonderful, the amusing, everything in between. This is definitely a book that I really want to revisit over and over again, things that I want to come back to. I just did so much learning in this book about topics that I'm absolutely fascinated in. I learned about the origins of the words that we use for the vagina, and how my personal favourite swear word, which is a word that begins with C, honestly I use that word so liberally, and people in Britain get like a lot more tetchy about that word than people in Ireland do. Like I feel like we use that word in Ireland like quite loosely but it is my absolute favourite swear word. It is actually one of the most feminist words that we have for our vagina. We're also looking at the erotic frescoes of Pompeii and what we can learn from them, and also the history of food and sex. There are so many topics covered in this book. I found every single page of this fascinating. I learned so much on every single page. Kate Lister is an incredible writer. Of course, she is unbelievably knowledgeable about all of these topics, but she also writes with such a incredible sense of humor that I really got on with. I would highly recommend this book. This is not only one of my favorite books of the year, but possibly one of my favorite books ever. Not even possibly, it definitely is. It's one of my favorite books ever. Please read it if you are interested in like this topic in any kind of way, which I'm guessing if you're on this channel you probably are. Another book that I read in April that I absolutely loved, and is definitely one of my favorite books of the year, is The Magnificent Sons by Justin Myers. In this book we are following 29-year-old Jake Darcy, who seems to have his life totally together. He has a great job, his girlfriend is great, he's definitely heading towards the kind of, you know, 2.5 kids and a white picket fence kind of lifestyle, but he seems perfectly content with that. Then his younger brother Trick, who on his 17th birthday comes out as gay. Trick is met with so much celebration and acceptance, and Jake's reaction to this is a little bit off. And as we come to get to know him as a character, we are realizing that he is dealing with his own struggles with his own sexuality. He is reevaluating his past in light of his younger brother coming out as gay, and Jake comes to realize that he is in fact bisexual, and that was representation that I really appreciated. We come to learn a lot of the internalized homophobia that Jake has gathered over the years, and how when his brother came out to such celebration, this was really confusing for Jake because he was very much pushed towards the traditional realms of masculinity, whereas it seems that, for want of a better word, the campness that Trick had was something that was always embraced and accepted, whereas Jake was terrified of exhibiting anything that might be a hint towards him being interested in men. Over the years, he's built up so much toxic masculinity as a way of shielding the fact that he was interested in men, because he felt like he would face a huge amount of prejudice. I thought all of the characters in this book were crafted in such a delicate way. They felt so authentic, so true to life. They felt complex, and you were rooting for all of them while also seeing how flawed they all were. because that's how humans work. And not only are we following the two brothers on their individual journeys with their sexuality, we're also following their story as brothers, how they have grossly misunderstood each other over the years. And I thought the evolution of that relationship was so beautifully done. There is so much to unpack with this book, and I'm not going to be able to do all of it in this wrap up, but I thought it was so fantastic. I would highly encourage you to read it. Absolutely brilliant. Such an accomplished book. I also read We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Burvoits. This is a very short book. I would say it's more of a novella than a novel. And in this book, we are following our main character, Hayley, who works for a very big social network. And her job is to review content that has been flagged as offensive and decide whether it is or not. She is a content moderator that sees content that depicts humanity at its very worst. And we follow how that experience desensitizes her to the world around her. There's a general sense of uneasiness as you read this book. It definitely feels that it is building to some sort of twist and climax. And when you approach the end of the story and you learn something more about Kaylee that changes your perspective on her as a character and as a narrator, as someone that you are trusting, we come to realize that she definitely wasn't a reliable narrator. When I came to that revelation, I found myself almost slightly disappointed that it wasn't a bigger twist. Like, I felt like I was leading up to something worse. It is horrific. Like, what it is leading up to is a horrible revelation. And I realized that I myself had become desensitized to the horrors of humanity because I expected it to be worse when it was something terrible. So in a way, I feel like that experience means the novella achieved its ambitions. It showed me how not only this character had become desensitized to the horrors of humanity, but in fact I had become desensitized to it as well. But in saying that, I think there is so much more to this topic that can be delved into. I think it's something that I would like to read a lot more about, because I don't really think we got to the meat of that experience of being a content moderator in these conditions. I think it's something that I would perhaps enjoy reading a whole non-fiction book about, because it definitely gave me a lot of food for thought, and I kind of left this story with more questions than answers. I also read Stay Up With Hugo Best by Erin Summers. I absolutely love the cover of this book. It was a huge cover buy for me, but I also read the blurb of it and I thought, yes, this is absolutely going to be a book for me. It is definitely one of those kind of young woman figuring her shit out books. It is a kind of, book that deals with the Me Too era. In this book, we are following 29-year-old aspiring comedy writer June and what happens when a late night talk show host who is a beloved TV icon but also notorious womanizer. He invites June to stay at his mansion over a long weekend, and we chart the dynamic between these two characters for I think about 4 days. And that's essentially what the book deals with. It deals with the strained power dynamics in that relationship, if you can even call it a relationship. It looks at the circumstances which allow men to get into these positions of power and how they abuse that position of power. I don't know what it was with this book. It just didn't quite hit the spot for me. I think it was perhaps because Hugo felt like such a stereotype. I don't think he felt, even though I'm sure there are tons of men out there like him, he felt like a cliche. And admittedly, these men probably are cliches. But even our main character, June, I felt like there was a level of disconnect with her that stopped me from seeing her as a fully realised, fleshed out human being. I also kept reading reviews that said this book was funny, and I didn't think it was that funny. So a bit of a mixed review on this one. If you think that topic would be interesting to you, I would still recommend that you read it. It was a really good book, just didn't quite hit that spot for me. The next book I read was Nothing I Wouldn't Do by Sarah Ella Osbeck. Every single person in this book is a hot mess. We are following Jax, who is a 30-year-old woman. She is working quite a low-paid journalist job, and her friends are at different sort of stages of their lives. Some of her friends are starting to settle down, some of them are starting to get married, and she feels like she hasn't really figured anything out yet. But the one area of her life that she feels like she has really got nailed down is her friendships. Her friendships are the most important things to her, and this book is fundamentally about those messy friendship dynamics and also how far you would go to protect your friend, because one of her best friends is going to get married. But then Jax discovers something about her best friend's fiance that is going to change everything. But there is a lot more to it than that. All of the characters in this book have they're so morally grey, extremely morally grey. I couldn't work out who we were really meant to be rooting for in this book. And to be honest, I think I came down on the side that I wasn't really rooting for anyone. They just, all of the people in this book are a hot mess. And in some ways I really enjoyed that, because that feels true to life. You know, people are complicated. And actually there were a lot of circumstances in this book that are complications to people's lives that I feel are so often just like brushed under the carpet, things that we don't really talk about. I actually think this book would make a fantastic buddy read, because it is such a kind of like roller coaster of that moral ambiguity. I think it would be really great to discuss this book as you're reading it. I think when you get to the end of it, there's just like, there's so much that has happened and so much of this moral ambiguity that's kind of difficult to summarize everything that happens. But yes, I love a book with morally grey characters, messy, complicated relationships, so I really liked this book. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about some books that I read for work as well, including a book by one of my absolute favourite authors, and that is The Secret Sunshine Project by Benjamin Dean. I know so many of you read Me, My Dad and the End of the Rainbow last year and loved it as much as I did. And if you loved that book, you are going to love this one too. This book mainly follows a young character named Bea, who is the younger of two sisters, the elder sister being Riley, who last year came out as gay, and in the most wonderful, celebrated, accepting circumstances. We love to see it. And last summer, after Riley came out, the whole family, mum, dad, Bea, Riley, they went to Pride in London and had an absolutely fantastic time. However, things have changed and now a very grey cloud looms over the family. Unfortunately, their father fell ill and has passed away, and the sisters and their mother are dealing with that grief. The family have to move to the countryside to live with their grandmother, and things are just very different from them. They're missing their friends, they're missing, you know, the culture of queer celebration in London, they're missing how busy things are in London. And Riley is hugely disappointed that she is going to miss Pride. So Bea takes this into her own hands and decides to bring Pride to this small countryside town. Now, this is not met without obstacles, including a neighbourhood busybody, but the book is such a beautiful celebration of Pride, as was Benjamin Dean's first book. But it really showcases how Pride can be such an incredible community event, full of love and celebration and excitement. It's a book that is just full of love and full of heart, and I cannot recommend Benjamin Dean's writing enough. I do have a proof of Benjamin Dean's YA debut, The King is Dead, on my shelf, and I'm so excited to read that soon. I also read The Marvelous Granny Jinx and Me by Serena Holly. This is a book for younger readers that I thought was also so much fun, and it is inspired by the real life story of the first black woman to be accepted into the magic circle. It is about Jada and her grandmother teaming up and auditioning for the Magic Society. The relationship between these characters is so fun, it's so cute, and all of the magic that they do in the book is really fun to watch as well. It's a book about friendship and family and following your dreams, and I just thought it was so much fun. If you're reading this as a grown-up, you will absolutely speed through it, but if you are looking for a recommendation for a younger reader in your life, I think this is one that would just be so inspiring for them. Like, I can so imagine a kid like reading this book and deciding that they want to become a magician and learning how to do all of these tricks. And in fact, if they wanted to do that, there is instructions on how to do some of the tricks in this book for yourself. They can learn how to do real magic. I also read How I Became a Dog Called Midnight by Ben Miller. This is a really funny body swap story about a young boy who ends up swapping bodies with a dog. And that might sound like the dream, but it's not all that it's cracked up to be, and they have until midnight to figure out how to swap back bodies. So much fun, a really great sense of humour to this book, just really kind of wholesome writing, has that kind of traditional fairy tale element to it with a modern twist. Very wholesome, cozy vibe. And finally, I want to talk about a picture book which was very kindly sent to me by Little Tiger, and that is How to Make a Book by Becky Davis and Patricia Hu. This is a very informative guide to the publishing process. So it begins with the process of a writer deciding that they would like to write a book and what they would like to write it about, and it follows them through looking for an agent, the book being acquired by a publishing house, what the design team do, what the editorial team do, what the sales team do, what marketing and PR do, what all of these different jobs in a publishing house do, how books are printed. I was actually pretty impressed with how extensive it was. Now obviously the book can't fit in all of the nuances of the publishing process. I was reading the section on sales, which is the area of publishing that I work in, and I was a bit like, oh well, that is a bit reductive and not quite right, and that's not actually what we do. But every sales team is different. And obviously the book wasn't going to capture like all of the exact nuances of the job. I think it was really accomplished in being able to do what it does in such a brief space. And I actually loved how meta the book got as well, because when it is, for instance, taking you through the design element of the book, it is using spreads that you've already seen previously in this book. Like, this book is the book that they're making within the pages of this book. It's very meta and it works very well. I think it would be really informative if you have a young person who is interested in books and maybe like it has questions around how books are made. I think this book is really informative for that audience. But me as a person in publishing, despite the fact that I was like, oh, I don't know if that's quite right, I enjoyed it so much. I would love to like give this as a resource to people to like teach them about publishing, and I really appreciated the whole thing, like seeing kind of my day-to-day life depicted in this way, even though the sales director is like an old white guy with a mustache, which, you know, at most places, is that inaccurate? No. But yeah, I just thought this was really fun. If you are in publishing, I think you would get a lot of joy out of this book. But equally, you know, if you've got a little person in your life that wants to learn more about books, this would be very informative. So they are all of the books that I read in March and April. As ever, they will all be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more about them. If you want to have a chat with me down in the comments, do feel free to do so. And if you don't have anything particular to add, leave me your favourite magic related emoji so I know that you're here. That is it for me today. I'm not going to disappear for another month. At least not this month anyway. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video, which will be coming up soon, I promise.